Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a history enthusiast, a tabletop game designer, and a lifelong lover of Age of Empires 2. And on this theory crafting series, I take a look at civilizations not yet present in Age of Empires 2 and take my best stab at creating a cohesive and historically authentic design for them as they might appear in the game as we know it today. It has been a balmy couple of days in New England, very unseasonably warm, which reminds me of how a certain other European peoples may have faced the sudden heat of the South as they migrated. Cue Mike Rolfe, who said that he might want to see the Vandals created someday. Well, Mike, you are in luck because I am rejoined today by the irrepressible Lorenzo M, who helped me out with my Romans build. Go take a look at that when you can. To bring you all, without further ado, the Vandals. Yes, indeed, the Vandals, a somewhat subdivision of the current Goths, though as you will see, they have many other elements brought into them as well. As always, if you want any disclaimers on my design process or want to know a little bit more about my philosophy and how I approach these builds, please take a look on the screen right now. And remember, as always, that there is a link to a comprehensive civilization document down in the description. It has all of my sources, it has all the little numbers and details that you might want to know about, and without further ado, let's move on to Vandal history. So, the Vandals are one of the more short-lived imperial peoples of the AoE2 relevant time frame. We're only really looking about a 400 to 500-ish AD year window, but a lot of living was packed into that single century. Now, of course, the Vandals did do plenty before this 400 AD cutoff, but to remind you all, 400 AD is where I consider the starting point to be for Age of Empires 2. And also, as a quick disclaimer, history on the Vandals is very, very scant. Most sources are secondary, so take everything that I say here with a little pinch of salt because we just don't know a lot about these people. But here's what we do know. So the Vandals, or the Vandali, started in what we now know to be Silesia in southwest Poland. They were a pastoral Germanic people who quickly found themselves tangoing with Rome at various points over its great imperial history. Around 100-ish AD, we know them to have been Roman foederati, who were tributary to the Romans and helped them out in war but were otherwise autonomous. The Romans enlisted them in the Dacian War over in the Danube region, but after that, the Romans helped them resettle in Pannonia, in what is now Austria. And there, the Vandals were relatively happy for maybe another 100 or 200 years. All this would change, however, with the coming of one of my history section's greatest recurring villains, the Huns, who started stomping into the region around 375 AD, driving many Germanic peoples, including the Vandals, westward. So the Vandals were one of many peoples of the region, not just Germanic, I should say. There were fellow Germans like Goths and Lombards who moved with them, but there were also Celtic peoples and others besides, such as early Proto-Slavs, all of whom the Huns corralled westward. But Rome said, no, wait, you can't cross our borders, that would be illegal. And the Vandals said, what if we did it anyway? As such, they, along with a fair few other migratory peoples of the time, busted their way into Italy, but didn't stay there for very long. Could Rome do much about it? Not really. The empire was somewhat in decline at this point already, and the Hunnic threat made this all the more complicated to contend with. They had to muster a military opposition. And as such, the Vandals quickly made their way through into what we now know as France by the time the Huns and Romans started clashing more properly. They were joined in this venture by several other peoples who were migrating alongside them and came into conflict with the local Frankish populations, who tried to oppose their crossing into their land. No way, you can't do that, that's illegal. What if we did it anyway? And as such, they came into a great bloody battle with the Franks at the Rhine River, marking the first time that the Vandals would fight under the same banner of their future best bros, the Alans, or Alani. Now, the Alani were actually an Iranian people living in the North Caucasus Mountains, and they were driven all the way through Europe by the oncoming threat of the Huns. But when they found themselves fighting side to side with these Germanic migrants, something magical happened, and the Alani and Vandali combined forces managed to beat back the Franks and secure passage into the south of France, alongside the Suevi people, another Germanic faction who they wouldn't stick around with for long, though there is some evidence that some Suevi integrated permanently into the greater Vandali-Alani force. Now, as mentioned, France would not be the permanent resting place for the Vandals. Instead, they quickly moved south into the Iberian Peninsula alongside their good friends, the Alans. By the time they made it into Spain, it was about 410 AD, and they spent almost 20 years in the Iberian Peninsula. They carved out a pretty substantial swath of territory during this time. The Alans ended up settling in the northwest of Spain. The Vandals mostly took the south, but there was plenty of commingling. But Spain, of course, was not unoccupied. In fact, the Romans had plenty of influence there still, and once the Vandals started growing substantially in power, Rome and its allies in the region started getting a little worried. They said, wait, no, you can't just settle here wherever you want. That would be illegal. And the Vandals said, what if we did it anyway? And during this time, the Alans officially joined in full union with the Vandals, becoming one unified people. Their combined kingdom would forevermore be known as the Kingdom of the Vandals and Alans, though whether they use that full title always is somewhat dubious. So anyways, Rome wanted to get the Vandals out of Spain, and one of their other local federati peoples, the Goths, specifically the Visigoths, started to move in and try to clean out the squatters. Most notably in 422 AD, where a Vandal and Alan combined force actually defeated a Roman army in the south of Spain, in so doing saving themselves from a likely genocide. Now, at this point, they gained full control of southern Spain, and in fact, the name Andalusia, which would later be how Muslim peoples referred to much of Spain, is thought to possibly derive from the earlier term Vandalusia. However, in 428, this would once again change. The Visigothic incursions were starting to get more and more fearsome, and at this point, the Vandals were outnumbered and pinned in the south. And you know what they did? They moved, this time into Africa, building a great fleet in Spain's southern ports, and making their way into what was, at the time, Rome's breadbasket. North Africa was absolutely chock full of bountiful crop fields, and the Romans said, wait! You've done this one too many times, mister. You can't just invade our breadbasket. That's illegal. To which the Vandals said, what if I do it anyway? And promptly started taking every city they could, including the main Roman stronghold of the region, Hippo Regius. This led to quite a few years of very intense fighting. At a few points it looked like the Vandals would be kicked out, but since the Romans were still hard-pressed up in their own home region, they weren't really able to secure any solid victories. Plus, there were a lot of Roman politicking and infighting at the time that made this even harder to get rid of. And so, the Vandals managed to win and establish themselves as a North African empire, taking over all of Rome's infrastructure in the region and completely abandoning their former Spanish holdings. The Alans were, of course, still among them during this time, and in this spot in North Africa, the kingdom of the Vandals and Alans would truly become entrenched and prosper. Over the next 2 decades, the Vandals gained unprecedented power due to their complete stranglehold over Rome's most important source of food. Rome quickly realized their mistake and said, wait, no, just kidding. We really actually need that. But the Vandals at this point had too many resources to be so easily dislodged. What's more, they started waging a naval campaign of dominance across the Mediterranean, claiming many of the outlying islands surrounding Italy, like Sardinia and Sicily and Corsica, as well as defeating the Romans so comfortably on the sea on multiple occasions that you gotta wonder, how did these Germanic peoples who never built a ship in their life do so well in naval combat? Well, they did, probably by initially stealing Roman technology and then iterating upon it. And in fact, they had so much dominance that in 455, the Vandals invaded Rome itself. This was due to a broken marriage promise that the then Roman ruler had reneged upon in pledging his daughter to a Vandal prince. And the Vandal king at the time said, no, absolutely none of that, marched on in, but he was negotiated with by the then Pope, who said, please, just don't kill everything. It's Rome. It's important, guys. And they said, okay. And they went in and they took everything they could carry and left. And in fact, to the best we know in the historical record, not a drop of blood was spilled. Meaning that the Vandal name, while now it has the connotation of destruction and vandalism and oh, it's bad, the Vandals were actually the gentlest of all of Rome's invaders at the time and left the place kind of neater than they found it. You don't need all that nasty gold cluttering up your temples and churches, do you? We'll have that. And so think about it. From a wandering barbarian people to 30 years later waltzing into Rome unopposed, the Vandals' dominance could not be overstated during this period. So much so that the Eastern Roman Empire got a little bit embarrassed. They're like, come on, guys, you're getting slapped around by barbarians. I'm sure we can do something about this. And so they started to send armies to try to get the Vandals out of Africa. Combined Eastern and Western Roman forces sailing in to try to land troops and dislodge the Vandals. And guess what? It never worked. They had 3 armadas smashed by the Vandals, who just completely dominated them on water to the point where they could never even land a force. By 476, the Romans and Byzantines just gave up and said, fine, take the damn breadbasket. I hope you choke on it. And they gave up for the time being. But this was a smart move by them, because by 500 AD, the Vandals were starting to weaken. Internal power struggles, a weakening and ineffectual rulership, and invasions from Berber peoples in the Maghreb started to take a toll on their kingdom, up to the point where at long last, the Byzantines were able to send a mighty force in 533, led by the famous general Belisarius, and wipe out the Vandals, though it was much, much closer than it should have been. By many accounts, Belisarius kind of lucked into his final victory because at a critical moment in the battle, the Vandal king lost heart and fled when he might have actually been able to win it. And so it was a close shave, but at long last, the Vandal king was brought to Constantinople in chains, and the Vandal people were dispersed, and by many accounts, either genocided or forced to migrate and scatter as a diaspora. In fact, they were so scattered that at this point in time, they are completely gone as a discrete people and culture, as are the Alani in this region, though in their home region, the Alani can still be properly traced. And so, anywhere in the Mediterranean and North Africa, there are likely hints of the old kingdom of the Vandals and Alans lurking in people's genes, though their culture, their stories, and their history are almost completely lost to us. Wow. One of the most dramatic history sections I've ever had the pleasure of reading. Let's move on to their flavor. It's going to be a bit of a weird one. The Vandals would have a Central European architecture style, though as I'll get into later, I am not fully satisfied with this. They would have unique skins, though, for a bunch of things. The stable, the dock, and of course the castle. The stable and the dock are the 2 most important buildings in the Vandal repertoire. Their language would be Vandalic, a language we do know some about, else, ladies and gentlemen. And their wonder is another one I'm not very satisfied with. We'll get into more of that later. The Harbor of Carthage. It's an iconic building. They would have had control of it at the time, but it did have a lot of water in it. So you could maybe model the wonder to not have that water if the transition was a little bit too awkward. But either way, you might be able to pick another iconic piece of Carthaginian architecture if you wanted, because that would still have been largely standing during the time of the Vandali occupation. Moving on to their campaigns. There are no shortage of great Vandal rulers we could look at, and so let's begin with the great Megachad who started it all, Gaiseric. This was the great Vandal king who led them into North Africa, thereby securing their eventual great kingdom, booting out the Romans against all odds, and becoming one of the greatest powers the Mediterranean had known since Rome was at its height. He was also the first Vandal ruler to be recognized by the Alani as their king as well, meaning that he was the one who effectively unified the 2 peoples into one. A Gaiseric campaign would feature some incredible battles, like the nail-biter defeat of the Romans at Hippo Regius, and he was even the one who led the famous bloodless sack of Rome after his son was cock-blocked trying to become a suitor to the Roman princess Eudocia. He's probably the most iconic leader the Vandals ever had, but I still think there are a few other good options to look at. The next one is a more interesting one, not focusing on a single protagonist. Instead, a campaign featuring the wanderings of the Vandals and the Alans, starting all the way when the Vandals were first forced into Rome by the Huns, to the Rhine River where they and the Alani joined forces at the first time to beat the Franks, into Spain and their fighting against the Visigoths, all the way to their final crossing into Africa. I think it would be very cool if every scenario featured maybe a different protagonist and really focused on the bond that started to form between these 2 very unlikely allies. It would be a whole saga, and I think it would be a fairly coherent one, unlike, for example, something like the Bari campaign. But that's not to say there aren't any other very interesting Vandal individuals we couldn't focus a campaign on. I propose Gelimer as the last of my major campaign offerings. He was the last great king of the Vandals, the one who Belisarius actually ended up beating. And so you'd actually be playing as the loser in a Gelimer campaign. That being said, he isn't just a loser. He was a very effective king, probably the greatest Vandal king since Gaiseric himself. And besides securing victories against the Berber peoples who were attacking the south of the Vandal kingdoms, Gelimer won many victories against the Romans and Byzantines before Belisarius finally overcame him. It could be really cool not only to feature Belisarius as an antagonist, he's one of the most interesting figures in history and he deserves to be featured more in the game, but also to play as this kind of tragic hero who's trying his best to secure the interests of his people and has many great victories, but his courage fails him at an absolutely critical time, leading to the eventual collapse of everything he sought to build. I think he could be a really compelling and interesting character to study in a campaign format. But let's move on to some potential Vandal appearances in existing campaigns. I really don't have many good ones for you here, folks. Maybe in Tariq, maybe in Bari, maybe in Alaric. It's really nothing very good. They're a very niche civilization who were incredibly impactful in their own particular pockets of history at very specific times, but didn't really show up in many other people's stories. Yet, I think there are many other campaigns you could tell that would have the Vandals feature prominently. That being said, there are a few other campaigns I wanted to touch upon as other offerings before we move on. The first of which being Gunderic. When the Vandals entered Spain, they had a co-leader system where they had two great kings at any given time. Gunderic was one of the two at the time, and he led the Vandals so effectively in their conquest of the Iberian Peninsula that he was eventually nominated their first great solo king. He was the one who also clapped the Romans at the Battle of Tarraco in 422, one of the greatest wins the Vandals ever had over the Romans, and was the first Vandal ruler to explore naval superiority, though not nearly to the degree that Gaiseric would later do. And while I don't think his story is quite as compelling as someone like Gaiseric, you just couldn't make a video like this without mentioning him. Moving on to the major themes that I identified while reviewing Vandal history. The first one is the trend of going from nomads to overlords. These guys had 50 years of migration before finding a permanent home in North Africa, and during that time, they were hard-pressed on every side. Attacked by the Huns, the Romans, the Franks, the Goths, everyone and their mum was trying to kick the Vandals out, and it made for a very interesting and compelling story of tenacity and hope. And to go from those humble origins to likely being the reason that Rome fell for good is just mind-blowing. And you might say to yourself, well, wasn't the Vandal sack of Rome bloodless? Yes, it was, but that wasn't why they were responsible for Rome falling. Rome committed so many resources to trying to reclaim North Africa, while also having their best source of food cut off, that they were not able to effectively deal with the many other threats that were plaguing them at the time. Not bad for a humble Germanic tribe allied with a couple of Iranian immigrants, eh? Moving on, another major theme where they were masters of the sea and of the horse, much like the great Greek Poseidon. They had been famed horsekeepers since pre-Foederati days. Additionally, while they took to the sea out of necessity, they were one of the most dominant naval powers the Mediterranean had ever seen, destroying two of the other greatest naval powers the Mediterranean had ever seen on multiple different occasions at once. Wow! Like, you cannot overstate how good the Vandals became at ocean going. And lastly of the major themes was their union with the Alani. It's such an odd couple. They became this truly integrated people who fought with these awesome combined arms tactics, blending Germanic elements and some of the nomad steppe elements that the Alani had brought with them from the Caucasus. There were probably other peoples within this integrated kingdom as well, such as the Suebi, who I mentioned earlier. But the story of the friendship and trust that formed between the Vandali and the Alani is really touching, to me at least. Maybe I'm just a romantic, but you don't normally see this sort of broship in history, and I absolutely am here for it. And that brings us to the end of our history section for the Vandals. If that's all you were here for, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe before you leave, please and thank you. And for all those of you who, like me, love Age of Empires and want to see what Lorenzo and I did with this Vandal build, let's go on to the game mechanics section, beginning with some necessary updates. I propose an overhaul to Germanic civilizations. You know how much I love regional units, and the Germanic peoples would be zero exception. I propose a regional Huskarl line, starting with a feudal age unit called the Oath Taker. Now, what would these units be? They would be anti-archer infantry, much like you see the Huskarls now, trainable at the barracks from feudal age. However, they would be very toned down from what a Huskarl looks like now. Obviously, their overall defensive and anti-archer-ness would be much, much weaker than a Huskarl in feudal age, but even once you hit castle age, they would still be less dominant than a Huskarl is now, though still filling a similar niche of being a very high pierce armor infantry with a little bonus versus archers, who is faster than average to help catch them. They would also have an innate weakness to sword line units, taking bonus damage from all of them. And as you can see, they have a very different cost to Huskarls, costing 25 food and 60 gold, as well as benefiting from supplies for minus 15 food. So they're a very gold intensive unit. The Vandals actually missed the final upgrade to the Oath Taker line, that being the Thane in Imperial Age. They also missed supplies. So while the Oath Taker will be a decent option for them in the early and mid game, it's almost never something you're going to want to prioritize going beyond that. These units would also be gained by a number of other civilizations. My Lombards build would get them, the Britons could get them, though probably not very good ones, and of course the Goths would get them for sure, though the Goths will be splitting, so what to do with their new unique unit remains to be seen. I was also considering civilizations like the Teutons getting them, but the Teutons are really depicting a much later era, so I decided against it. Are there any other civilizations that you'd like to see getting the Oath Taker? If so, let me know down in the comments section. I was thinking about maybe the Scandinavians getting them, but they already have the Viking and the Longship. Plus, it would be tough for balance, but still, if you guys think there's a strong historical reason for Scandinavian factions to get the Oath Taker, I'm all here for it. Second of the necessary updates that would need to preclude a Vandals build would be the Huns would need a new team bonus. Why? You will see shortly. My proposal is that the Huns would gain the team bonus upon advancing in age. 1/2/3 in Imperial Age free scout units would instantly spawn at your starting town center. So in Feudal Age, everyone on your team gains a free scout unit of whatever type they have. In Imperial Age, everyone gets 3, but if you have multiple town centers, you don't get more than 3. I think this much better reflects how the Huns would actually have interacted with the peoples they allied with. It's not a matter of, oh yeah, you're stable, you can produce horses faster. No, it's we are massing our horde to attack. It's a more aggressive bonus that I think will angle them more towards early game, which I think is good, and less towards late game paladin spam, which never felt quite right to the civilization, for me at least. Let's move on to an overview of the Vandals as a civilization. The Vandals, a navy and cavalry civilization. First bonus, their town center can be packed and moved to new locations. You've seen stuff like this in custom scenarios before, I am sure, and huda, it is in reference to their nomadic origins. I envision this being a rather useful bonus in early game. You will miss one villager-ish in terms of production time, but you'll be able to park your TC right on top of resource nodes or reposition it if for some reason your enemies are hard pressing you. And later in the game, it will also allow you to have this rather interesting migratory playstyle where you're able to move your town centers to new resource nodes as old ones dry up. Of note, I know this would be dangerous and douching, and that's why we have a qualification to it. Until Castle Age, if you move a town center, it fires at a far reduced rate. And even with that, it will still serve as a very effective defense towards any sort of early raiding. You're just not able to out DPS other town centers, making it completely unviable for any douching use. Don't worry guys, I'm learning. If a bonus can be used for douching, people will use it for douching, so I'm trying to adapt. And big props to Lorenzo, he was the one who really pushed this bonus, and I think it makes perfect sense for the civilization. Second bonus. Your farms cost twice as much, but last 4 times longer. They have 4 times as much food in them. Additionally, your farmers work worse, but your farming upgrades improve their work rate. All this is to say that until the Vandals entered Africa, they were not able to set up effective farming infrastructure of their own, instead having to rely on whatever local findings they were colonizing at the time. But once they got to Africa, whoo boy, their farms were brutally effective. And because of that, in post-Imperial Age, you can be counted on by far and away the best farms in the game, bar none. Earlier on though, this will probably be more of a penalty than a benefit. Third bonus. Demolition ships cost less, scaling up to minus 50% less in Imperial Age. The Vandals were probably the single most effective users of fire ships, what demo ships were more properly known as, in history. On a few occasions, they were able to completely obliterate Roman fleets by sneaking fire ships into their lines and catching entire fleets on fire. And because of that, it just did not feel right having a build that didn't promote the use of the demo ship in some way. And as you'll see later, they have another bonus that makes the demolition ship even better. We'll see if 50% off will coax people to use demolition ships. Even then, they still probably won't be an incredibly strong unit, but if anything will do it, it will be something like this. And I'd be happy to amp up this scale down rate if they just weren't getting much use. Third bonus, transport ships with a crew can convert enemy warships. This is my take on a boarding galley style unit, but in this case it allows any transport ship that the Vandals have with a little flag on it to immediately be a threat. Now, how does this work? The transport ship first has to get up close to an enemy ship and convert it in melee range. Second of all, they convert at a fixed rate, and that rate scales on how many crew the transport ship is carrying. If they have a full 20 stack, they can convert a ship incredibly quickly, like a matter of seconds. However, once they pull off a successful conversion, half of their crew will go on to the new ship, even if it could not normally hold units. They can still drop them off, they can't take on new ones. This means that one transport ship can't just endlessly convert everyone. It will lose crew over time and need to be recrewed before it can go out there and steal more enemy ships. Lastly, since this requires a full 20 stack for optimum efficiency, it really will only be most effective in post-Imperial Age, but still, even in Feudal Age, a 5 stack on a transport ship might be able to pick off an enemy fire ship or galley before it can bring down the lone transport, because transports are pretty tanky. So I see this bonus being relevant at all stages of the game on island maps if you have a canny Vandal player. Moving on to team bonuses. Like the Swiss, they have 2. My reason for it? They were a unified, integrated kingdom. I feel like team play and forging alliances is a big part of Vandal history, and as such, 2 team bonuses. The first one, Arson benefits mounted units, and the bonus damage that Arson grants also extends to eco units, trade carts, villagers, etc., and monks, meaning that all the infantry and cavalry that the Vandals and their allies field have the potential to be absolutely vicious raiders. Now, while the Vandal sack of Rome was famously bloodless, they caused a lot of bloodshed in other places, and savagely destroying the settlements of their conquered peoples was very much par for the course. While I think that this bonus is not going to be overpoweringly strong by any means, I do think it will make the Vandals a very, very good raiding civilization at most stages of the game, and make a team with the Vandals on it very, very deadly if you're not fully walled up. Second team bonus. It's the good one. Stables work 20% faster, stolen directly from the Huns shamelessly. Why did I do this? The Vandals were the masters of the horse, and they were known from it from a very, very early time. They were horse keepers. If that's not a stable work speed bonus, I don't know what is. And we see how strong the Huns are through this bonus in team games, while still having it be relevant in 1v1. I really think the Vandals needed a kick like this from a powerful bonus to compensate for the fact that they have 2 naval bonuses at base, as well as their other 2 base civilization bonuses being kinda weird. Their farming one is a penalty early on and only gets strong later, so the stable bonus should help them get some much needed power early on to reach their late game farming boom potential. Let's move on to unique units. They have 2, starting with the Froya. This is a support cavalry, a type of chieftain. The Froya was the Vandalic name for a war chief of some kind. It's an expensive unit, costing 75 food and 150 gold. It is a high HP throwing axe cavalry. It doesn't have great range, and it doesn't really have great damage either, but man is it hard to kill. It, however, has a very useful ability. Within its line of sight, anytime an enemy building is destroyed, you get gold. This is in reference, of course, to the war chief's leading raids. And even in the famous bloodless sack of Rome, plenty of gold was taken. And it would have been war chiefs like the Froya who oversaw the pillaging efforts. The amount of gold that you get off of a Froya depends on the type of building. I have comprehensive examples of what gives what on the civilization document linked down below. Go take a look if you like. And I should affirm the Froya's ability does not stack. This is not going to be a unique unit that you make tons of, rather one that you sprinkle in through your armies such that you can get some much needed income off of your raiding and destruction, enabled partially by your arson bonus. The second unique unit of the Vandals is the Catapult Galley. This costs 150 food and 125 gold, and it is functionally a cannon galleon, but weaker and available in the Castle Age. Its Imperial Age upgrade, the Elite Catapult Galley, has the exact same stats as a current cannon galleon, while being overall cheaper even after being upgraded. I gave the Vandals this unit because as a thalassocracy, it felt essential that they have an offshore bombardment unit, even though cannon galleons would be so unfitting for their history I just couldn't bring myself to do it. The Catapult Galley is a way of giving them that option in a historically appropriate way, while still making some different playstyle options available to the Vandals through its inclusion. The fact that you get these things in Castle Age and they're cheap should make them much more interesting, and possibly something that you might even build in competitive 1v1s if you can screen for them with your other strong naval units. On to their unique technologies. The first one, Integrated Kingdom. This gives the Vandals and all of their allies access to the Oathtaker unit, the German regional unit I mentioned earlier, the Camel, and the Steppe Lancer. Additionally, all Vandal regional units are trained 33% faster, meaning all of the ones I just mentioned. The Vandals do not actually get the Camel line normally, so Integrated Kingdom will give them access to a completely new unit, while also, of course, enabling this for their allies and giving the Vandals a very good train speed bonus that will be relevant even in 1v1. All of these three regional units are definitely kind of more niche counter unit type dealios, but being able to pump them out quickly could allow for the Vandals to have some really interesting counterplay options open up to them. For example, massing up elite Steppe Lancers late game at blazing speeds to conduct a quick raid with your arson bonus. I don't foresee this technology being gotten every game, but I think that it enables enough interesting strategic options to make it at least a consideration even in 1v1. Second unique technology in Imperial Age, Dominium Maris. This makes it such that all water is revealed perfectly, as though you'd research spies for water tiles, and your warships move 25% faster for a minute. Both of these effects will vanish after a minute elapses. There will be a little timer available to you up in the corner, and Dominium Maris can be researched any number of times, though it gets more expensive to research every time you do it. This technology alludes to the fact that the Vandals were so good at anticipating Roman and Byzantine naval incursions through an elaborate spy network. They had their ears out in every corner of the Mediterranean, and knowing when and where and how many Roman vessels were coming into attack was part of why they were so good at winning these naval engagements. This is one of the things that I think will make their demo ships very dangerous, because demo ships that are cheap and move fast sounds very, very scary to me at least. Make sure you check out the Civilization doc down in the description if you want to see any of the further elaborated details on any of these bonuses or uniques. That all being said, let's move on to a tech tree overview. Letter grades, beginning with their infantry, it's a C. They do have the Champion, they have the regional Oathtaker line into the Huscarl, but obviously they missed the Thane upgrade, they missed Halberdier, they missed supplies, and plate mail armor. Infantry is not their specialty, which should make it quite interesting to have a Germanic civilization that doesn't focus very heavily on infantry. Though I will say the arson bonus does help. For archers, it's a B-. They have really good heavy cavalry archers, fully upgraded in fact, including Parthian tactics, alluding to their Alani alliance, but they miss crossbowmen. Ouch. Stuck with archers. So you're not going to be using their archers very much in early game unless you want to pull off some sort of Spanish gigabrain misdirection strategy. Still though, having good cavalry archers that also benefit from their arson bonus will have the potential to be very dangerous if you use them effectively. On to the cavalry. It's an A, ladies and gentlemen. They have their unique Froya, though that's not really a cavalry thing. They have the elite Steppe Lancer. Through Integrated Kingdom, they get camels. The only thing they miss is the Paladin. And on top of all that, they have their awesome arson bonus and their stable bonus. This is a cavalry civilization that will do well in every stage of the game and will specialize in lightning-fast raids that are good for ripping through enemy infrastructure while also netting you some gold in the process if you have a Froya tag along. They also have some really great and expansive stable options, what with both Steppe Lancers and camels being available. Onto the siege. It's a B+. They have siege engineers, and while they don't have bombard cannon, they have a perfect siege tree otherwise. If that's not a B+, I don't know what is. Defenses, though, are poo. No guard tower, no fortified wall, no bombard tower, no masonry, no treadmill crane, no hoardings, ew. Don't play defensive with the Vandals. It's not going to be a winning proposition, though I will say the TC bonus is kind of defensive, but that's mostly going to be useful early game. I should note, by the way, that when a TC is packed with their team bonus, it's much more vulnerable. It can't be destroyed easily, but it can be destroyed much faster than a normal town center would be. So like rolling up town centers to the front line to provide covering fire, not going to cut it. Not if your opponent is paying any sort of attention, at least. Onto the economy. It's a B-. So obviously they have very good farms late game, and their Froya is kind of an economy bonus. It will get you a lot of gold, but they're missing a butt ton of economic upgrades. Gold shaft, stone shaft, two-mans, guilds. It's not pretty. And though your farms will be very good and very efficient late game, early game, it's going to be more of a penalty than a benefit due to the reduced work rate and the added upfront cost. Not a strong penalty. We know that, for example, the Mayans still have good farmers even though they work pretty slow just because they get more food out of a farm. So I don't think it's going to be that bad early on for the Vandals, but enough that I don't think a B is merited despite having a very strong late game eco bonus. Oh, and I guess I should note the town center bonus is kind of eco focused. It will let you reposition your town center to be a better drop point early game, which is something, just not a big something, if that makes sense. On to levies. This is my term for a trash unit, a unit that costs no gold. The Vandals lack halberdier and plate mail armor, but otherwise their skirmishers are fully upgraded, their hussars are fully upgraded, and they do make hussars quite fast. Plus, I guess their pikemen and hussars benefit from the arson bonus. Overall, I guess you could maybe argue a C+ for the levies, but I didn't feel confident giving them higher than a C, since missing halberdier is a pretty big deal in a trash war. And the dock, it's an A+, baby. I think they'll have one of the best water games in the game. Not only do they have two quite good and potentially very relevant civilization bonuses for water, which take them in very interesting and different strategic directions, but they have a perfect dock tech tree, factoring in, of course, that the catapult galley replaces the cannon galley, and the mighty Dominium Maris for late-game naval dominance. I'd even say that their farming bonus is a big plus on islands maps where wood is limited and you'll want to conserve it for shipbuilding as much as possible. In cases like that, having a little bit worse food production for much better wood efficiency is going to be a plus in the vast majority of situations. So in summary, Vandals, water, yes. And lastly, their monks. It's a C+. They don't have illumination and block printing. They don't have most of the Imperial Age stuff, but they do have most of the Castle Age stuff. So monks will be good for monk stuff in Castle Age, nothing more than that. On to their playstyle. How do I envision this Vandals build working in-game as we know it today? Well, let's begin with the early game. It's a weird one. They have the mobile town centers, farming is kind of discouraged, so you'll want to wait to make farms later than you normally would. But they do have very strong scouts, so when you hit Feudal Age, you'll be able to do some really nice quick rushing that will get even more deadly come Castle Age when you can upgrade to Knights, maybe light cavalry with that arson bonus. You do have other rushes available too. Men-at-Arms are fine, and you can do some weird archery stuff if you want, but you do also have the interesting early option of the Oath Taker. Sometimes you see Eagle Scouts being produced in Feudal Age, and I see the Oath Taker filling a similar niche. They're less fast and less versatile, but they are very, very good against archers, and because of that will be a very good response to enemy archer rushes. On to the mid-game. This is where the Vandals will start to hit their stride a little more. They have some really strong cavalry options available to them. They have arson, they have their Froya, which can accompany a cavalry raiding party to get some gold out of the venture, and of course they have steppe lancers and camel riders if you research Integrated Kingdom. Now, of course, they don't have crossbows, and that's one of the best Castle Age options in the game right now, but they do have good cavalry archers. They're not cheap like the Huns, but they do get that arson bonus. And as we know from the Saracens having cavalry archer bonus damage against buildings, that can be relevant at times, though I think anti-villager damage will be much, much more useful. Lastly, their water. In the early game, their water play will be quite good, but in mid-game, it gets much better. Their demolition ships get even cheaper, and their transport ships will start to be able to carry 10 units, which will make their conversions a lot more feasible. So if I were to grade the Vandals for their early game water, it would probably be like a B+, because I do think the farming bonus helps out, and those early demo ship and transport ship things could be marginally helpful. Once you get mid-game into late game, it's an A for sure. Speaking of which, the Vandal late game is going to be all about mobile raiding armies. You're going to have your Froya leading these quick posses of hussars and steppe lancers and just ripping through things and getting gold out of it. Their defenses are second worst in the game, probably only after Goths, but they do have some good counter units available. Their skirmishers are fully upgraded, they have Huskarls, though not ideal, they can drain them fast, and they have very good heavy camels. So you should be able to functionally counter any unit type your opponent sends at you, except maybe very, very strong heavy infantry. They also, of course, have naval dominance going for them in the late game. Dominium Maris, I think, will be incredibly powerful. The Catapult Galley can get some foothold in Castle Age and only gets better in Imperial, though it technically falls off to elite cannon galleons, who makes those in competitive anyways. And most importantly, their farms will give them huge staying power on naval maps, allowing them to funnel wood into ships where it belongs, rather than into people's mouths. Don't eat the wood, guys, it's bad for you. Let's move on to some loose threads. We finally tackled most of the build. I wanted to touch upon some of the other ideas that Lorenzo and I had that didn't quite make the build that I'd like to share with you guys. Tell me if you think any of them would be better fits than what we have here so far. First of all, the transport bonus is a little bit intricate. The whole, oh, it can convert, but it's based on how many people are on it, and then half of them get off. There's a lot going on. I think that all pieces of it serve a mechanical purpose, and I'm sure there'd be some like balanced design kinks to iron out, but that's the sort of thing that would probably require play testing to do, and I'm fairly happy with it as is. Lorenzo initially proposed a boarding galley unique unit of some kind, but we both agreed the catapult galley was an even better fit, and the transport thing was a way to kind of allude to that, and I think synergizes really well with their kind of mobile raiding gameplay. You know, like user transport, convert some enemies, then land the stuff on the transport on the enemy island and go and raid. I think there's good synergy there, but I could see some people thinking it's too much. Next of all, the architecture and wonder. Lorenzo and I talked a lot about this. He also thought that the wonder was probably the best we had right now, and he had the idea that their architecture could evolve dramatically, like maybe starting Central European and then becoming Mediterranean and then becoming African. I think that could be cool. My only concern with that is those are very discordant architecture styles, and so it felt like maybe a little bit too much. I could see perhaps starting Central European and then evolving into Mediterranean. That's something I did with my Lombard build. But I wanted to get your take on it. What do you think? How do you think we should address the architecture situation and how it might evolve or not? And lastly, the farm bonus. It is a pretty big penalty, and there could be a better way to do it such that it doesn't hurt you as much in early game. That being said, I was kind of operating off of the principle that Mayan farmers are still perfectly fine, and they have something like, I think it's like a 5 or 10% functional penalty, and this is just a little step below that with even greater upside than Mayan farmers. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. Is the farm bonus too much? Before we move on to tabled ideas, there was actually one other thing I wanted to touch upon that I just thought of doing this presentation. Obviously, the Vandals have a very big focus on regional units, and when Lorenzo and I were considering regional units, we did briefly table the idea of elephants. Obviously, Carthage was famous for its elephants, and while neither of us could really tell for sure whether elephants were still in use in the area during the Vandal times, it is plausible maybe they could get the armored elephant and siege elephant, for example, and it would add into their regional unit flair, get some benefit from Integrated Kingdom. Maybe it could even come as a result of Integrated Kingdom. Love to hear you guys' thoughts on this. I think it could be a really cool piece of flavor. I'm just not sure on the history. Tabled ideas. Some stuff that didn't make the build, but we wanted to share with you now. 1. The Froya serving as your starting scout, your war chief leading his people out into the great wilderness. Obviously, it would be drastically toned down till Castle Age, just ended up being a little too complicated, and I've been playing around with unique unit as starting scout a lot recently, so Lorenzo was like, come on, Robbie, let's be a little less wacky here, shall we? I always need that from my collaborators. Another one. Arson initially gave a gold trickle when attacking buildings. We obviously relegated a similar function to the Froya because it felt like a cool way of making something very interesting done with the unique unit. And I also think that the current Arson bonus is going to be more impactful a majority of the time. Next, Petards, also benefiting from the demo discount. This was something Lorenzo came up with. He really wanted to find a way to make Petards work. He even proposed a unique upgrade to the Petard called like a Saboteur that wasn't as strong as the Saboteurs we see in the scenario editor, but maybe could get kind of close. I thought it was cool, but I just couldn't see any history for it, and I hate Petards, to be perfectly honest. Definitely interested in hearing whether you guys think this is a good idea or whether there's any history whatsoever that could back it up, because if so, I could definitely be convinced. Another one was initially we had the demo ship bonus be about turning their gold cost to wood and making them maybe deal a bit more damage to ships. Lorenzo quite liked this idea, but then I had the realization that on most water maps, the limiting resource is wood, not gold, and therefore removing the gold cost doesn't really help very much. I love the idea of trash ships. I want to play with that more in future, but for now, I think that just reducing the cost is going to be a better way to promote demo play than doing something like this. We talked a lot about how to do a farming bonus. Lorenzo tabled the idea of farm upgrades giving you like some free reseeds, so functionally just giving you a bunch of free wood that you can only spend on farms. The way that I have it now in the build, as I mentioned, I'm not certain whether it would be fully well balanced, and there might be a better way, but I do like how it makes you disinclined from using farms early and very inclined to use them late, which feels very in theme for their history, but just know that there's certainly other ways that you could go about this bonus. Another one, integrated kingdom sharing unique units and cavalry archers, as well as what it does now. I felt like it was getting a little full, so I wanted to kind of set a cutoff at some point. And another team bonus, the first stable you build is free. If you didn't want to steal the Hun bonus, this is what I would go with. I think it references the history quite well. And it would mean that if you had a Mesoamerican ally, they could build a free stable too. Yay, they get Xolotl warriors, one of the shittiest units in the game. Yippee-ki-yay. Still cool and thematic, and a way to have Xolotls be functionally visible in random map games. And as mentioned earlier, Lorenzo proposed a boarding galley unique unit instead of the transport bonus, as well as he had this idea for unique technology called Trinitarian Persecution, which would give some sort of big anti-monk bonus. We never really crystallized what that would be, and the arson bonus kind of alludes to the same thing. The history behind this is actually really cool. The Vandali were actually devout Arians, which is a particular sect of Christianity, and they had been Arians since their days up in Pannonia before the Hunnic invasion. And so wherever they went, they would persecute non-Aryans, especially Catholics and other Trinitarian people. In Africa, they were so cruel to local Trinitarian peoples that it was one of the major compelling reasons that Rome and Byzantium continually tried to attack the realm. Obviously, they wanted their breadbasket back, but also, look at all these poor Christians being persecuted, you naughty, naughty Vandals. So definitely a big part of their history. We just couldn't find quite a way to fit it in or figure out what exactly it would do. And with that, we come to the end of this mighty Vandals build. Thank you all so much for watching. Before we move on, the likeLyometer. In my opinion, how likely is it that the Vandals, maybe looking something like this build, could appear in-game at some point in future? And for the Vandals, my pick on the likeLyometer is an 8 out of 10. Ooh, that's a pretty high grade. As Mike Rolfe mentioned in that comment I featured at the very top of the presentation, Sandy Peterson, one of the developers of Age of Empires, said in an interview that the Vandals were actually one of their considerations for a civilization to add to the game, and that does mean something. Additionally, if Return to Rome gives us some Age of Empires 2 civilizations, I think the Vandals are one of the top picks among them. Once again, a massive thank you to Lorenzo M. He is a great collaborator. He knows a ton about late antiquity, and I consistently love working with him. Lorenzo, you're the man. Thanks for helping me make this happen. Your original Vandals build you shared with me way back in the day was of huge inspiration. And to all the rest of you, I want to know, how do you like this build? What would you have done differently? Do you think there are any elements of the history we didn't manage to sufficiently cover or tackle or address? And of course, I want to hear from you. What else would you like to see me do on this channel in future? But until then, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.